can I introduce you firstly to my co-editor of GeoSport, Carole Gomez. We're going to be asking the questions today with our guest, James Dorsey. Can I say to people who are in the audience today, you are strongly encouraged, thoroughly encouraged. I wish I could say incentivized to ask James questions. So James has asked that rather than he just talk and respond to a set script, what he's very keen to do is to receive questions from the audience. So this live Q&A is to mark the launch of GeoSport. GeoSport is a collaboration between IRIS in Paris, and Carole is the representative from IRIS in Paris today, and also emlyon Business School, and I'm here as the representative of emlyon Business School. GeoSport is a digital platform that we will be sharing the details of later on today via social media, essentially focused on the geopolitics of sport. Given my background working in a business school, I like to refer to it as the geopolitical economy of sport, because I always have an interest in the implications of the world around us in terms of business, in terms of management, in terms of commercial activity. To illustrate for you what GeoSport embraces or encapsulates, just give you a simple example. Yesterday, I was approached by a journalist from Denmark to ask me about Mesut Ozil and Arsenal. And I get, at one level, this may simply be an issue between a player and the club that employs him. But as some of you will know, there is a history, a recent history involving Ozil and Arsenal, and a tweet that he posted in support of Uyghur Muslims last December. And there were ramifications at the time, and it appears as though there continue to be ramifications. And so one of the issues that Ozil now faces is that he's no longer officially part of the 25 player squad that Arsenal now has officially registered. And one of the reasons people are speculating for this is that Ozil and the issue around the tweet and Uyghur Muslims and China has played a part in this. It's worthwhile keeping in mind that Arsenal's shirt sponsor is Emirates Airlines from Dubai. And obviously that is an important constituent part of this. From my perspective, why I'm interested in this particular case is that sponsorship. My background is in shirt sponsorship and marketing, and as I said, business schools. So hopefully that gives you an illustration, a very small illustration of why geopolitics and the geopolitical economy, I think, is very, very important. For those of you who are writers and commentators, we do welcome submissions to GeoSport. And what will be happening is in the coming weeks and months, there will be short articles, longer articles, and audio-visual content available. So we do welcome you to submit. And what we try to do is to turn these articles around very, very quickly. But what I do feel is that speed is of the essence, because we live in a very dynamic world right now, not just in terms of COVID, but in terms of some of the political changes. We've got an American election coming up. We've had the Black Lives Matter movement this year. We've just talked about Ozil. We've got the growth of China, a whole series of issues that have really been stacking up this year that hopefully we intend to address as we proceed from here. Without wanting to talk too much, can I just say two final things? Firstly is a big round of thanks to IRIS and emlyon for their support, but also to Estelle Brun, who is one of the co-editors alongside Carole and me. Estelle works for IRIS, and also to Paul Widdop as well from Manchester Metropolitan University, who also co-edits GeoSport with me. I'm not going to dominate conversation. Carole, any additional words that you would like to say about GeoSport and before I introduce James?
Hi everyone. It was a quite complete perspective that you give. So just to remember that the platform is now available. You can find it on the website, IRIS website. You can find the link on the social network, but also on IRIS. Please do not hesitate to submit some articles, especially if you think a matter, an issue could be interesting to analyze through two scope. The first one is geopolitics, and the second one, of course, about sport. So do not hesitate. And I think that now we definitely all want to hear James Dorsey about the situation, the current situation. So I leave the floor.
No, you don't really want to hear about James. You want to hear about me just a little more, you know, not about me, from me. Can I just say that the 4 pieces coming up, the 4 launch pieces for GeoSport coming up, one on geopolitics of esports, which is now available, one on Black Lives Matter in sport, one on Israeli cycling diplomacy, and another on the Premier League TV rights negotiations in China. So do look out for those, and we will post on social media later links to these. That's enough. I'm not going to say any more, other than, how do I introduce James? So I've known James for a long time, and for me, James is James. So I think the first time that I met James was in the Gulf region, and James has got just incredible insight. For me, I found what he was saying, what he was talking about, really captivating. I'd not really heard people talk this way before, or talk about the things that James had was talking to me about before. And since then, I've spent endless hours listening to James, reading what he has to write. And some of you may be familiar with his both his book and his blog, The Turbulent World of Middle East Soccer. But I think, you know, many of you will know James for not just being a writer, but also being a commentator, an analyst, an academic. I always remember your phrase, James, or your word, a hackademic. So not an academic, a hackademic. So a kind of hybrid journalist academic, which is, for me, has been really important in terms of my career and in terms of the way that I've chosen to develop my career. Your use of the word academic is really, really important. So James, before launching into the questions, can you tell us what's occupying you right now? What kind of projects are you working on? Are you writing a book? Are you publishing?
Well, first of all, thank you. That was a very generous introduction, and I really appreciate it. And thank you and the business school for inviting me. Actually, what I'm working on right now is less related to sports. It's a book that I'm calling The Battle for the Soul of Islam, which is essentially the rivalry for religious soft power, and we'll come back to soft power later on, between various Middle Eastern states, as well as various Asian states. That's one major thing I'm working on. The other major thing I'm working on is Gulf security and how that's evolving.
Okay. Sorry, I'm just promoting Carole so we can see her. Hi, Carole. Could I start, James, by asking a very simple question, which is aligned closely with the focus of today's launch and today's session, and that is, why does the geopolitics of sport matter? What's your view on that? Why does geopolitics matter to people who are interested in sport?
Well, the simple one-liner answer is because politics and sports or sports is by definition political, and sports can generate soft power. Now, there are a number of reasons for that. One is, I think, in a still globalized world, the nature of diplomacy has changed. So if in the past it was pinstripe suits who were in the foreign service of a state and attended receptions and had a glass of champagne, today it's public diplomacy, it's sports diplomacy, it's cultural diplomacy, And that all has to do with soft power, the realization that that in order to be able to achieve your goals as a state, you need to have popular buy-in from those countries you expect either help or you want to dampen criticism that there may be. And that is indeed the soft power aspect of it. Take football. Look at, as Simon, you well know, Manchester City. You have a club that was bought by a very wealthy owner with an abominable human rights record. That is not something that matters to fans. And so in that sense, the UAE has garnered enormous soft power by essentially being able to do so without any damage. I think that's one thing. The second thing is soft power, certainly in the Middle East, and particularly in the Gulf, is very important. And it's important because you have energy-rich monarchies who are incapable of defending themselves. So if you look at Qatar, when in 1990, the Iraqis invaded Kuwait, the Kuwaitis, the conservative Kuwaitis were in Saudi Arabia sitting it out. The less conservative Kuwaitis were sitting it out in the casino in Cairo, while a global coalition liberated the country. And the then the emir had just come to power in 1995, realized that's the way to go. And so if you look at why Qatar is hosting the World Cup, why it's so engaged in sports, the reason is it's one of the pillars of its soft power effort. You also have something else that's I think relevant, and that is that as the world is rebalancing from one superpower to a world in which you have two or three powers who have to balance things between themselves, the same is happening in sports. You look at FIFA in terms of the role that, for example, Middle Easterners play in global soccer governance and regional soccer governance. You look at where recent World Cups were held from South Africa on, but now Qatar. You have China bidding, you have Turkey bidding. And finally, if you look again at the bids over the last few World Cups, increasingly, it's either Western nations who have the infrastructure already and don't really need to invest a great deal, or it's autocratic states. Which brings you back to the issue of soft power. So if you're an autocratic state with a bad human rights reputation, or a policy that's very assertive with military interventions elsewhere, with all the consequences of that, garnering that soft power becomes very important.
Can I just ask you, James, because increasingly people use this phrase, soft power, these words, without really understanding what it is. So in your view, what is soft power?
Well, basically, it's not hard power. With other words, it's not a power that is either backed by military capability or by the ability to coerce. It's basically an effort to garner empathy, to be liked, frankly, to put it very simply. So, for example, if go back to the example of Kuwait, these were Western and non-Western militaries putting their troops at risk to liberate a sheikhdom on the Gulf. unless you have that sort of empathy, governments aren't going to get the buy-in. And it's going to be much more difficult domestically. So that's the importance of soft power. I do want to add one thing here, which goes a little bit to your first question. And that is that underlying all this issue of soft power and of geopolitics is the fact that sports is by definition political. Sports and politics are like Siamese twins, hooked at the hips, and there's no way you can separate them.
Why do you say that? Why do you say that?
Well, first of all, because going back to soft power, you look at how countries are ranked today. And sure, they're ranked on their economic strength, they're ranked on their military strength, but they're also ranked on how they perform internationally in sports. So that's one. Two, certainly in countries that are not democratic, there is total control of sports. Because venues like a football stadium are potential venues for protest. And these are countries that do not allow for any form of uncontrolled public space. But to be fair, it's not just autocratic countries. Go back to the 2006 World Cup in Germany and the German government's interference with the German Football Association to ensure that they had the votes to be able to host the World Cup. So that's what soft power is about. And I think where the real problem, but we may come into this later on in the discussion, but I do want to throw it out. You have a situation in which international sports associations simply deny that there is any relationship with politics. Their boards often demonstrate that that's not true. But nonetheless, they uphold a fiction that sports and politics are separate. And what that does is it allows the sports associations and politics to do whatever they want because the relationship doesn't exist. And in all the discussions that we've had over the last 10 years about corruption and wrongdoing in sports, and particularly in football, but not exclusively, the one theme that nobody really wants to touch is that relationship and try and start to think about how do you regulate it.
Mm-hmm. So, Carole?
Yeah, it's quite interesting to hear you about this particular point, especially when we saw the article that Thomas Bach published last week in the Guardian, for example, and he say politics and sports don't mix, and he tried to explain why it doesn't mix, but obviously I fully agree with you on this point. Maybe a question about what you said about sports diplomacy and with the Gulf region. Many countries try to develop for a long time now, or more recently for some of them, a sport diplomacy. So in your opinion, there is several types of sport diplomacy, or do you see them as one with several specificities?
Well, let me just come back to Thomas Bach for a second. What's really interesting is that if you go back to just after probably a year after he became president of the International Olympic Committee, he gave a speech in Korea in which for the first time you had a sports executive acknowledging the relationship with politics and sports. Now, he was very careful. In my mind, I would have liked him to have gone further, but it was the first acknowledgement that there is that relationship and that it's a relationship that needs to be regulated. So that's one. sorry, my mind is gone. What was your second question? Just give me a buzzword.
Just about the sports diplomacy, the several types of sports diplomacy in the Gulf region.
Okay, let me answer that in two ways. I think they're all aspects of the same thing. So, with other words, whether you sponsor, whether you acquire, or whether you host, it all serves the same purpose. Now, I think you've also got to understand the limitations of sports policy or sports diplomacy. So with other words, you can do all those things, hosting, acquiring, and so on. And the Gulf states do that for different reasons and in different ways, but for the same reason. But there's another aspect of sports diplomacy, which I think is a fallacy. And that's the idea that sports can build bridges and that it can be the driver of building bridges. So at the moment, for example, you have a lot of people arguing that the fact that Qatar is hosting the World Cup in 2022 opens the possibility to put an end to the three-year-old boycott by Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, and Egypt. And I think that's pie in the sky. Because the implication of the thought is that sports can be a driver in these things. It can't. You know, you go back to the 1970s ping pong diplomacy when Kissinger was around. That was only possible because Kissinger and the Chinese had already talked, and they had created an environment that was conducive towards building bridges. Without that, ping pong would have been an event. And if you look at, just to end this bit, if you look at two incidents, the 1914 football game between Germany and Britain during the First World War, sure, they had a ceasefire for 24 hours. They played a game of football. And then for another 4 years, they killed millions. Fast forward to 2007, when the Iraqis, against all odds, won the AFC Cup. And for 24 hours, Kurds, Sunnis, Shiites, whoever were dancing in the streets, they were embracing each other, they were celebrating this, and 24 hours later, they were back at sectarian warfare. Mm-hmm. So I think you've got to understand very clearly what sports diplomacy can achieve and what it cannot achieve, at least not on its own.
For me, this brings in a whole series of questions. There is a question from the audience from Aditya, which I'm going to specifically address in just a moment. But can I say to anybody who's sat listening, if you do want to ask a question, please do send a question in, and we'll do our best to get there. Aditya asks about Saudi Arabia. So I'm going to, in a second, I'm going to ask you about Saudi Arabia, but I actually want to take a step back because Carole is sat in Paris. I'm supposed to be in Paris, although I'm not right now. We then begin to think about Paris Saint-Germain and the Qataris and Qatar Sports Investments and the World Cup and beIN and all of those things. And you said, James, that soft power is about empathy. It's about getting people to like you. Some other people would say it's also about getting people to see the world in the way that in the same way as you do. So can I ask you a very simple question?
I would totally agree with. That's what I meant with liking you.
Well, can I ask a question? Do we like Qatar because of what they've invested into sport?
Look, I think that Qatar hasn't generated the kind of soft power that it would have wanted to generate. Now, I think there are two reasons for that. One is the Qataris themselves, and in some ways, they're getting less credit than they should. So the day they won the hosting rights for the World Cup, they naively thought, this is it. We're on our way. And they were totally taken aback when the tsunami of criticism came, particularly with regard to guest workers, migrant workers. But to be fair to them, and that's the part that I feel they have not been acknowledged for, they also did what no other Gulf state has done. So on the one hand, their public relations was a disaster, and people told them, if you put your head in the sand and wait for this to blow over, then once you pull it out of the sand, you're going to find that you're on the defensive and that you've lost the moral high ground, which is exactly what happened. But what they did at the same time was they engaged with human rights organizations, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch. They engaged with the International Labor Organization and with the trade unions, something that no other Gulf state would or has done till today. And they took various initiatives, not all of which came to fruition, but in and of themselves were actually interesting and smart initiatives. And again, very slowly, they should have done it at a much faster pace. They introduced a reform of the sponsorship of the kafala system. And they also did other stupid things. A foreign, a North African football player who played for the team that is owned by the military, and there was a dispute. And so instead of just paying him out, it's peanuts for them, getting rid of the issue, they held him for 18 months in Qatar, didn't allow him to leave the country. And that did them great damage. But then there's another aspect to all of this. And that is that the United Arab Emirates, from the moment that the Qataris won the World Cup, were on the warpath. And that accelerated even further in 2017 when the diplomatic and economic boycott was introduced. And if you really think about it, Qatar is one of those countries, Qatar, Turkey, Iran, where that you mention it and it already almost immediately has an emotive response, whatever your view of the state is. You say Gabon or you say Morocco, you're not going to have that kind of response. And it's an often visceral response. Partly because, again, first and foremost, the UAE is brilliant at public relations. And the Qataris have gotten far better and in many ways have handled the boycott very well. But I think that that's really the context in which you've got to measure how well did they do on soft power. At least in terms of football, you look at Qatar Airways, they did very well. I mean, it's one of the top airlines in the world. It's an airline you want to fly.
So the question, moving it kind of just jumping over the border a little, if we're allowed to do, I'm not sure we can do it, but move over the border from Qatar to Saudi Arabia. We've got a question from Aditya who asks, what are your views on the recent decision by Saudi Arabia to make golf free for women?
I think you've got to look at this in a broader context, which is that up until 2015, with other words, the rise of King Salman and his son, Mohammed bin Salman, the Saudis weren't really involved. They weren't one of those Middle Eastern countries that was looking at the soft power aspects of sports. That only started in 2015. And for all practical matters, it's been a train wreckage from day one. But if you look at Vision 2030, which is basically drafted by Western consultants, Mohammed bin Salman's vision of liberalizing Saudi Arabia, of diversifying the economy, there's a recognition in that that just for public health reasons, sports in Saudi Arabia needs to be universal. The Saudis, unlike the Emiratis, are horrendous at public relations. They simply don't understand it. And so one of the things that Mohammed bin Salman, first of all, he's a generational change. He's in his early 30s. So he understands what a majority of Saudis want and what their aspirations are. And they're all people under 30. And entertainment was one of those things. A liberalization to some degree of what women can and cannot do was crucial both for economic development, but also crucial for the kingdom's image. And the Gulf, free Gulf for women is one more of these gestures. The problem is that Saudi and Crown Prince bin Salman has so damaged his own reputation that it's not these kind of things that are going to do it.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask you about what for me proved to be a very fractious part of my pandemic year, and that is Newcastle United. I wrote something earlier in the year that said Saudi Arabia won't buy a Premier League football club. And I took a beating on social media. There was a lot of trolling. So it was a really kind of raw period of time for me personally. And I think I know what went on, but can I ask for your views? What do you think was going on? What was that all about, that whole Saudi Arabia Public Investment Fund, Newcastle United issue about?
Let's take a step back, and let's look at what is the Saudi sports diplomacy train wreckage, of which Newcastle United is just the last episode of it. So Mohammed bin Salman comes to office and he realizes that sports is important. And he has as his sports czar someone who has the same degree of hubris and the same degree of recklessness that he has. So they pumped $25 billion pump more, but they decide that they're going to use part of their investment in SoftBank, the Japanese venture capital, to buy influence in FIFA with a $25 billion fund to establish 2 new tournaments. They unsuccessfully try to twist Morocco's arm to vote to support the boycott against Qatar, and otherwise they would support the United States rather than a bid by a fellow Arab state, which is what they did at the end. They tried to create a new federation of Middle Eastern and South Asian states outside of the confines of either the Asian Football Confederation or FIFA, and that whole initiative falls apart. And then you had the fiasco in Egypt, where the sports czar, Turki al-Sheikh, buys into Al-Ahli, one of the foremost Egyptian clubs, and essentially is kicked out. And so I think you've got to look at it in that context, that there's sort of this understanding we should be in this game. And particularly we should be in this game because of both the Qataris, with whom they have a conflict, but also the Emirates, with whom they have differences, and they manage those differences. So in that context, it becomes important. They've seen what Manchester City has done for the Emirates. They've seen, despite now the court cases in Switzerland, what PSG, Paris Saint-Germain, has done for Qatar. And that's what they were after. Not understanding, and again, this is across the board, not just in the case of Newcastle United, but across the board, not understanding how badly they've damaged their own image and reputation, and what it's going to take to repair that.
So I want to let one of our guests, Anirban, take us across to China and India in a second. But before that, there are two questions. If I could ask the question posed by Yoav first, and then Arno has asked a question as well. So Yoav is asking about the normalization of relations between the UAE, Bahrain, and Israel. What do you think the consequences of this might be for sport?
Well, it's quite fascinating. You've already had two very interesting developments. One is that a club in Dubai has bought an Israeli player. Now, granted, he's an Israeli Palestinian, but he's an Israeli. That would never have happened before that. And the interesting dynamics are going to be what happens when that club plays international matches with countries that don't recognize Israel. That's going to be the litmus test for how sincere this is. But then you have a second development, which I find far more fascinating, and I think if it happens, could have ultimately far-reaching consequences. And that is an interest expressed by an Emirati businessman, although without doubt with government approval, to acquire or at least get a stake in Beitar Jerusalem. Beitar Jerusalem, historically and until today, is the most militant, most anti-Arab, most anti-Muslim club in Israel. Israeli Palestinians are among Israel's top players. Beitar Jerusalem has never hired a Palestinian. When they have hired non-Arab Muslims, they've been basically kicked out. Now, this is the club that has been the club and is until today the club of the Likud. Every right-wing leader in Israel is a fan of Beitar Jerusalem. So the notion of the United Arab Emirates or somebody in the United Arab Emirates buying particularly this club rather than any other club has great significance. And I think they may find that it's going to be tougher going than they believe it is. But they do, I believe, think that that's one way of addressing, again, soft power, but also addressing a community that they would not be able to reach otherwise, in the hope that they can shift attitudes.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, James. It's an area of the world that, as you know, I have a great deal of affection for, but I also find frustrating and I think there's a lot to criticize, a lot to debate as well. But I just want to kind of move direction, and before I head east geographically, I'm going to go west. I think Arno is in Europe somewhere. Arno is asking, how do you assess the effectiveness / robustness of sport contributions to the realization of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals? Do you have a view on that?
Frankly, it's not something I've given a lot of thought to. Look, there is a lot of things that you can do with football. So, before I argued that football is not a bridge builder. More often it's a divider. That's at sort of the top level, if you wish. But if you go down to the grassroots level, kids, young adults, women, disabled, whatever groups it is, there's a lot you can do with sports. And I would imagine, and I know groups that have done that, who use sports to try and engage students or people in broader issues, including very fundamental issues that you need for sustainable development. I don't know. I hope, Arno, that this answers the question.
It's a really interesting topic, subject for discussion, Arno. It may well be something that we have to come back to as a platform and discuss in more detail. So Carole is nodding her head, so she'll be organising that soon, I'm sure. If I could switch to Anirban's question. Anirban asks, can badminton diplomacy reduce tensions between India and China?
I don't think any sport, whichever sport you think of, is able to reduce tensions unless the parties to the dispute or the conflict want a reduction. And there's no indication that particularly the Chinese, but both the Chinese and the Indians are going to back down on this. So I don't think badminton, whether it's badminton, whether it's boxing, whether it's football, handball, whatever it may be, I don't think it's going to make a difference unless you have a change of attitude on both sides of the China-Indian divide, where they're looking for ways to improve relations and they're looking for ways to build bridges. At this moment, neither of them are.
Mm-hmm. Can I just take a step back again and thank Peter? Peter has just posted a URL in the question and answer section on a memorandum of understanding involving the United Arab Emirates and Israel. So thank you, Peter. That's much appreciated. If we could go back east again, James, and part of my life seems to be spent focused on the Gulf region, and part of my life seems to be spent focused on China. And we could comment on China in lots of different ways, but given that we're here today to talk about sport specifically, I think we can restrict it to sport. You know, what's your view of the role that China currently is playing in sport, and what are some of the recent developments that really stand out for you in your mind that China is engaged in?
You know, if the issue with Qatar and the United Arab Emirates' involvement globally in sports is reputation laundering, that's what it is in China, at least partly. So if you take football, Xi Jinping, without doubt, is personally passionate about football. And he has great ambitions for where he wants China to be on the international football playing field, if you wish, in terms of, you know, hosting the World Cup, winning the World Cup. And he's put a lot of money into that in terms of, you know, grassroots training for football, sponsorships that you've seen with FIFA and with others. And let me just make one remark, which is also true for the Gulf states and for the Middle East in general, which is, with football particularly, you are talking about the most popular form of popular entertainment, bar none. So if you have a successful football team and you are an autocrat with a tarnished image, then you want to be associated with that success of the football team because that's your football team. And if you go back almost 10 years to the Arab popular revolts in Egypt that toppled Hosni Mubarak, a lot of the people on Tahrir Square would tell you, I'm not going to watch a match of the national team. That's Mubarak's team, not mine. I mean, so, and I think you have the same element in terms of wanting the success, both because of his own passion, but Xi Jinping also wanting that success, both in terms of being able to project China in a different light, not, you know, about concentration camps in Xinjiang and cultural genocide, or the utopian surveillance state, and so on. But also because if China is successful, then that's something that he can use to enhance his own reputation, because that's his success.
So is this nation branding as well? Is that the same thing, or is it something different?
I don't know that China needs nation branding, frankly. I mean, China is one of those countries, if you couldn't find anything else on a map, you would find China. People know. And so I mean, there are other countries where nation branding, Qatar, for example, with the World Cup, where nation branding has value. Reputation, I think, in terms of China, is far more important, and it also raises really a very fundamental question. So, if sports and politics are incestuous, if you wish, then the issue of human rights, whatever decision you take, so whether or not you say, human rights and that's politics, don't have anything to do with it, but we will judge a bit on its merits, or you say, sorry, for example, to China, given the abominable human rights record that you have, there's no way that we can entertain your bid. Whichever decision you take, it's a political decision. And that's a decision that will be coming up.
Carole?
Yeah, maybe on this one, and linked to what Judge just said at the beginning, the article of Thomas Bach was really interesting because it talked a lot about boycott. He never write at every place the word Beijing or China, but it was obviously the idea that he has behind his head. So what is your thought about this risk of boycott? We can see, we can read, we can watch some people, organization, NGO calling for a boycott of Beijing. Do you think it could happen? It could have also a real impact, because often we talk about boycott or sanction, but we don't think about the efficiency of the tool. So what is your thought about this?
Okay, I think there's several questions here. One is the efficiency. Do sanctions work? It's a good question. Obviously they're not working in Iran. However, so if you were looking at a sports bit of China, even if the boycott is symbolic, it has value, because if you don't boycott, you've just given up. You've not taken a stand. Now, see, you've also got a second issue here, which is the fiction of mega sports events leaving a social and economic legacy. They usually leave a lot of white elephants in debt. There aren't that many cases where you see that the granting of the right to organize a mega sports event has any real impact. I would argue that Qatar is an exception. And for the very reasons that we discussed before, you would not have had that process on migrant labor without the vulnerability that Qatar had at that moment as a host of the World Cup, and therefore the need to engage and to be seen to be correcting things. it's highly unlikely that you would have that effect in China. And if you go back to 2008, the Chinese made all kinds of promises on environment and freedom of the press, and look at where we are.
We've got a question come from Peter. So which is, given sport activism's growing prominence, and he puts Black Lives Matter, Marcus Rashford, equal pay, how can politics possibly stay out of sports? Will this open activism continue through the Olympics and the World Cup, in your opinion?
Two things. One, you've had that kind of activism before. Go back to the 1968 games in Mexico, where people raised a black fist. I think there are two issues here. One is, I think you are going to see greater activism. And you're going to see greater activism not only because of sports as such, and this goes partially back to Carole's question in a sense, but if you look at the last decade, it was a decade in which autocrats or authoritarian leaders who thought primarily in civilizational, not in national terms, were the dominant players. You know, Trump, Putin, Narendra Modi in India, Xi Jinping, let's go down the line, the major players. So that created an environment in which you could do many more things. The next decade, in one way you can predict, and that's going to be, and you can already see if you turn the news on, it's going to be a decade of defiance and dissent, of anger, because of longstanding issues on inequality and what social justice that precede the pandemic and the economic downturn, but certainly have been seriously sharpened by them. And you look today at Chile, you look at Pakistan, you look at Nigeria, this is what you're going to see. And I think you're going to get that translated into player activism. But there's also a second, and that goes back to your discussion about Mesut Özil. Why would players not have an opinion? Of course they have an opinion. And why should their right to express themselves be curtailed? So in the case of Mesut, who tweeted on the Uyghurs in Xinjiang in China, the club, by cracking down on him for that reason, is doing China bidding. Which takes me back to sports is politics.
We've got, which I think is a great question. Brian, thank you for asking it. So we were having started off in France and traveled through Qatar, through India to China. We're coming all the way back to Africa. So Brian's question is, how can Africa exercise soft power or practice sports diplomacy to its advantage?
Well, first of all, Africa is like Asia. It's a very diverse continent. So I don't know that Africa as Africa can do it.
Can I just say that Brian is from Africa? He's from Kenya, if I remember correctly.
Well, Brian probably knows it better than I do, frankly, and I would invite you to disagree with me. What I do think is, if individual countries are successful in that, that reflects back positively on Africa itself. But it's really going to be bottoms up in a sense rather than down, of building that soft power and engaging. The problem is that often African countries don't have the means and the resources to do it. I mean, there are a number that do, but a lot don't. And certainly, again, Africa is one, it's certainly going to be economically one of the hardest hit parts of the world as a result of the economic downturn. But Brian, please disagree with me.
Brian, I really want to say something here, but Zakayo has just sent in another question. I'll come to you, Zakayo, in a moment. There's something about the indomitable lions and the super eagles, and if you remember the 2018 Nigeria World Cup shirt that was a fashion sensation across the world. I think there is something about Africa and soft power and sport, and there are some really interesting issues and developments that we need to talk about. But firstly, I'm aware of the time, and secondly, I think it's such a big subject.
Let me just say one thing. You know, the reason I said resources and the wherewithal to do it is these are not single shots. This has to be a sustained, well thought through effort. And so, yes, you're right. And there's also, of course, the soft power comes with that, with African players playing in Europe and elsewhere. But you really need a soft power strategy in which you embed sports. You know, whatever it is, it can be cultural, it can be culinary. I mean, look at Morocco, has done great with in the culinary field with its food. And with its design. But you really need that package and the ability to put a package like that together and the ability to implement it. And that's what I don't see for much of Africa.
So Carole and I have made a mental note of this for the future, a webinar on the geopolitics of sport in Africa.
Definitely.
Something on the soft power of Mohamed Salah, maybe, or something related. I want to go to Zakayo because Zakayo has asked a question of James, and it's in response to Peter's earlier question. The question is, do you think activism by top athletes like Lewis Hamilton will have an impact upon sport policy or political policy?
I don't think it's going to have, well, it depends. With other words, the more activism you have, the stronger the pressure is going to be on sports executives and sports officials. I mean, clearly, and again, look at Black Lives Matter, and the way basically the NBA and other sports associations embraced it after their players had expressed themselves politically in favor of Black Lives Matter. And what that means is two things. You've got to have critical mass, not just one player. And you, again, like with other things, you need to have an environment in which sports executives, government officials, what have you, no longer can avoid it. You know, from the sports executive side, this was force majeure. And that's the kind of pressure that that athletes can generate. And they generate it in and of themselves because of who they are, but they generate it also because they're models for large groups of people. And it's, it's hard to measure what that impact is, but if your idol takes a stand, and idols are important to you, then you're certainly going to listen.
Now, James, I know that where you are in the world, it's rather late now, so I hope you've got time for just two more, and it is only going to be two more questions.
This is still early for me.
The first one is Anirban. I'm going to give you the last one. Although, Anirban, you've had two questions. You're trying to monopolize here. But before I get you to get back to Anirban, I'm going to go to Ewan. And Ewan asks, do you think sports diplomacy will become more formal and more important over the next decade?
Well, I think it's important already. And that's why you're seeing a lot of money being poured into it, both commercial funds as well as government funds. And I think that's certainly going to be true going forward. Now, first of all, most countries are sports crazy. So sports is important in the private lives of a significant number of people. And certainly in countries where the political consequences of the economic downturn can be serious because of the autocratic nature of the regime, that link to sports success is going to become even more important for them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And then the final question from Aniaban, I'm going to take you back across to the Middle East. Aniaban asks, with developments in the Middle East, do you think that Israel will join the AFC? And if it did, what would be the geopolitical impact of this?
You know, it's a fascinating question. And I don't know what the answer is. I think eventually, yes. So go back to 1974, Israel was expelled from the AFC, basically by the Arab and Muslim vote. And it then wandered around Oceania and what have you, and finally ended up in Europe, which was good and bad. It was good in the sense that they were competing and playing the best of the best. But they weren't quite at that level yet. So whereas if they had been part of the AFC, you have a number of real powerhouses, including several Middle Eastern soccer powerhouses. Israel would have been one of them. The question is, and I don't know what the answer to that is, that even if the AFC would be willing to readmit Israel, and you know, if they were to apply today, my guess is that you would still have some Muslim or Arab resistance, but you'd also have a number of Arab and Muslim countries voting in favor. The question is whether Israel wants to go back. And I don't know what the answer to that is.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We do have one final question. Zakayo, you don't send me any more questions, please. I've got one more question. And if I don't ask this question, Paul, who is one of our co-editors, he'll never speak to us again. So he's asking, in the case of Russia, if you have military power, why would you continue down a soft power path?
Well, I think that question goes for any country with military power. Why do it? I think for two reasons. One is military power is one element of your power. It doesn't matter how strong you are militarily, you need that soft power. And therefore it's not a question of either or. It's a question of how do I manage both.
Okay. So if I could hand over, Carole, any final thoughts, questions, issues from you?
I have tons of them, but I think I will just say something about what you just said, James. It was quite interesting to see how hard power, soft power developed since Joseph Nye developed the concept, and now we have the concept of smart power, trying to combine both of them. So we can, with sport, we can definitely see how we can use it in order to achieve one of the goals that you have. I think that the answer that James make, but also the other question, give us plenty of opportunities to talk more about these topics, a lot of topics. So yeah, I'm really interested about this one and really look forward to next steps.
So James, can I just say that I've hated today? I've absolutely hated it. and the reason that I've hated it is because we only got 60 minutes. For people like Carole and Paul, Estelle and others who are in the room, they'll know I could sit and talk about this for not just hours or days, but weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. So I've hated today, far too short. The territory we've covered, obviously from France and the Middle East through Africa to Russia and to China was incredible, and pulling things out. And thanks for saying that, Carole. Smart power. I've got to think a little more about smart power, but smart power, soft power, hard power, diplomacy, nation branding, Black Lives Matter, Mesut Özil, the World Cup, Beitar Jerusalem. Even in just 60 minutes, we've covered huge ground. So thank you, James. Really, we're grateful for you taking part today and for agreeing to help us launch GeoSport. Thank you to Carole for being so patient with my pursuit of questions and answers. Thanks to the audience for being around. And what I would say to everybody who's been involved today is keep watching, because we'll be sharing some more content through GeoSport. We'll be posting some articles later on today, and there'll be some further events in the future. So thanks to everyone, and wishing you all the best for the remainder of the day and for the rest of the week. Thank you.
Thank you all for inviting and indulging me. I enjoyed it. These were really good questions.
Yeah.
And indeed, it would have been fun to go on a bit longer.
It was our honor, James. Thank you.
It was an even better answer. So thank you. Thank you very much.
No, Mike, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.